My name is Noel Hadji-Michael, and yes, it is an Australian accent, but after 10 years, 10 winters in Britain, we have the passports, we're good migrants, you're stuck with us, so let's move on. My job was to do two things. Firstly, very briefly, to thank you all and to thank Tony and his band of co-conspirators for choosing this location and this space in central London, in Whitehall, for this important event and this important conversation. For 140 years, the National Liberal Club has been a place not just of drinking and wining and dining, lots of hot air, but it's also been a place of serious conversation about the issues that impact on the Britain that once was and is and will be. We have 2,500 members now. They don't look like me. They're young, they're diverse. Sometimes those 35 new members, 31 are women, and the majority are from observable minorities. This is the new reality of this corner of London. The fact that a young man called Tony Dent and his team chose us is to our credit, and it's very gracious of him to continue the relationship with the National Liberal Club. I am the chair of the Defence and Security Circle here, and your work on the economy, your work on Britain's robust understanding of itself, official statistics, the health of the economy, the way we measure things, is absolutely critical to the defence of the realm, to technology investment, to our pension funds, and to our sustainability to meet the challenges of today and the challenges that are coming at us at great pace. So on behalf of my crowd, sometimes rather unelegantly called spies and squaddies, that's a terrible observation because we also have other people. The reality is that Tony's work, the work of this organisation, and your conversations are in the national interest. So thank you for joining today. You are brave souls, courageous souls, the Friday before a bank holiday weekend. So thank you very much. Tony, I think your next speaker is now in the room so we can stop the filling in. So thank you very much.
I'll hand over to our chair, Sir Vince Cable, who I'm sure you're all aware of. At one point was our Secretary of Trade and at the BIS, where I first had Vince's acquaintance, and I was pleased to do so. And I have to tell you that in tradition of all good executives, non governments, I wasn't allowed to get anywhere near any money. I had to only ever talk to civil servants. And that's how I cut my teeth on trying to understand our statistics. And I'm very grateful to Vince for his contribution today, and I'll hand over to the coordinator. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I applaud the work that Tony and his team have done in making us more aware of the really big problems we have with data in the UK. And I just want to talk this through. There is a general problem about statistical weakness. I'm sure this has been a recurrent theme during the day. I want particularly to talk about some really serious problems. I've been trying to excavate the spreadsheets between the INS numbers on immigration, and the point I'm going to make in a few moments' time is that the whole debate on immigration in the UK has been massively distorted by faulty numbers, chronically faulty numbers on overseas students. Another area where we desperately need good data and aren't getting it, and particularly if this government moves somewhat to the left, we'll be having accurate information on wealth and asset distribution, which we don't have. And then a particular bee in my bonnet, which is the distortions when we come, this is not a particular issue for the INS, but the distortions which come when we try to compare different countries. You know, should we be talking about real or purchasing power parity adjusted measures, giving us radically different views of the world, which is important in terms of formulating public policy around countries like India and China and so on. Okay. Well, I just produced a summary here of, I think there are 73 cases in recent years of suspension, cancellation and revision of major data sources, and covering a wide expanse of public policy. I think you all know about the labour force survey, scandal, embarrassment, whatever we want to call it, which has affected policy in relation to interest rates, welfare policy, the setting of the minimum wage. You know, the government's currently legislating on 0 hours contract, but do they actually know what the hell is going on in the labour market where 0 hours are concerned? Probably not. Immigration impacts on wages and employment policy, particularly long-term youth and so on. The suspension of the wealth and assets data was critically important. It was conducted during the pandemic by telephone, which produced a very distorted sample. And as a result, decisions are currently being made on government based on data which affect wealth tax design, mansion taxes, whatever, savings behaviour, inequalities between regions, and I've added a few others I'm not going to talk about, the annual population survey, the long-term migration data, which I will refer to in a minute, the household crime survey, which of course is central to political debate, and information on the digital sector, which again was suspended, radical impact on how we calculate GNP, make assessments about digital taxation. Thank you. Well, I'll plunge straight into the controversy about immigration data. The top line is net immigration, as we were told by the official sources. This is during the period of the coalition government I was very much involved in, and we were supposedly operating to a target, 100,000 target, you may remember. And critically, this depended on the student number calculation. I was the Secretary of State. David Willits was the Minister for Universities, and we were very concerned about what was happening, because we had the INS and the Home Office publishing data year after year telling us we had an embarrassing rise in net immigration, which was causing kind of near panic in the government. You know, Cameron had to rush off and try to renegotiate our arrangements with the European Union, making promises about Brexit referendum. It caused a lot of bad feeling. What David and I realized, we dipped a little bit into the numbers, was that these numbers entirely depended on the fact that the INS appeared to be counting students coming in, but not counting them going back. And there was something fundamentally wrong, and we questioned this, and we were told not to worry about it because there were airport surveys, we were told. So we grumbled, and I publicly complained about it, but the world went on using official numbers. And I've tried here to, but essentially what I discovered, I dug out the spreadsheets from the official data a few days ago, and it turned out that there were numbers for students going back home. But the assumption being made, and what the statistics were showing, was that 90% of all the overseas students were actually staying in Britain.
Yeah.
It's completely bonkers. I mean, this is no way that this is remotely represented reality. The universities do their own tracking studies. The Home Office and the INS now agree that we're probably talking about 10% staying, something of that order. Some people go on to postgraduate and work visa routes. And there's a bit of leakage to illegal immigration. About 40% of the students are Chinese, and we know they go back because the Chinese keep an eye on them apart from anything else. You'd have to assume that every single Indian student stays in Britain, though since these are mostly fairly affluent Indian families who've forked out several £100,000 to send their kids here, why would they want to stay packing shelves in Tesco's or whatever you do when you stay behind unofficially? So the numbers make absolutely no sense. So what I've tried to do is to look at the net student numbers produced by the INS, because you see every year we've got over 150,000 net. The number of overseas students was actually constant, but according to the official statistics, they're coming and not going out again. So there's a big problem here. What I have done is to recalculate, just taking the students out altogether, and you'll see that for most of this period, actually the government was meeting its £100,000 target, if they'd only known about it. Slight increase in excess in 2015, but not dramatic. And actually, the whole story about Britain being swamped by massive immigration is based on phony data about overseas students. And I put it as crudely and simply as that. And I haven't yet found anybody willing to acknowledge that. Towards the end of my tenure as Secretary of State, I did write a rather intemperate letter to the oversight body for the INS. And they wrote me a rather sniffy letter back, but I haven't yet had any acknowledgement that this problem occurred and that it had and has, massively distorting effects on public policy. So if there's anybody in the room who is an investigative journalist or an ambitious academic, they might want to dig a bit further into how this disaster has actually occurred and how we now navigate our way out of it. So that was one area where I think statistics have had a massive impact on public policy and a very negative one. I want to look at another one that hasn't yet materialized, but to look at the whole issue about wealth distribution, because this is now becoming a major sort of branching point in British politics. If we do get a movement to the left in this government, it will be based on inequalities of wealth. The data we have is a little bit fragmentary, and it's based on the asset survey in 2020 when the pandemic was taking place. And I've just summarized the main components of wealth in the UK with the Gini coefficient representing the degrees of inequality. But what's important for public debate is the international comparison. And if you believe the British statistics, Britain is a paragon of equality. We're not an unequal country at all. It may be true, and we're all looking at the wrong stuff, but essentially the UK, at least in terms of the top 1% of assets, is the most equal country, one of the three most equal countries in the world alongside Netherlands and Belgium. We're far more egalitarian than Sweden, which doesn't feel right somehow, but maybe it is. But our public policy, to some extent, is based on the assumption that we're down here, with the United States and China, France, maybe. And the practical consequence of this argument about wealth distribution is whether we should have more or less wealth taxation. And I've just summarized here the public policy debate that's going on in Western Europe, and you see that almost every European country, including those that have very egalitarian philosophy, and in places like Denmark, which has dropped wealth taxation, similarly Sweden, Germany, France, and others which have retained it on the basis that you can deal with one segment where wealth asset liquidation isn't easy. Norway, I think, is the only country that has a continuing wealth tax of the kind that is now being advocated in the UK. We have a move towards taxing high-value property that would be appropriate if you're looking at practicalities. Probably the model, in many ways, is Switzerland, which has low and cantonal wealth taxation and operates on the basis that they get wealth tax revenue because it's far more trouble avoiding the tax than it is actually paying it, because it's very low. And they do get a certain amount of useful revenue. But, I mean, I'm putting all this stuff up because, you know, we are going to having a big national debate on whether, you know, wealth taxation is right, or should it be increased. And it's all based on statistics, which are actually quite flattering and suggest that Britain is a far more equal country than we've been led to believe. So it clearly needs work. This is the last of the specific bits of statistics that I want to talk about in relation to public policy. And this has got nothing to do with criticising British numbers. This is just a conceptual issue which economists argue about. This is comparing countries' GDP. And you often hear politicians, and I was one, you know, Britain is the fifth biggest economy in the world. That's the phrase we always used to hear. And that's based on nominal GDP, in other words, GDP at current exchange rates. And that's the dark column. And you've got the US number 1, China number 2, Japan number 3, I haven't put Germany here, or France, and then the UK round about here. However, you know, statistics are questionable, and an obvious point that many people who've been involved in the developmental world are very familiar with is that price levels are massively different in different countries. And this is this famous hamburger test, that an identical hamburger costs a different amount in different countries. And that is a very crude measure of how countries are overvalued or undervalued in their exchange rate in real terms over a long period of time. And so corrections have been made, and I'm here using the numbers of the IMF. Different people have gone about it in different ways, who have published a correction of GNP numbers, taking into account purchasing power parity. You adjust for different price levels, and you get a very different story, where, in fact, China is now very substantially the biggest economy in the world. Going quite apart from the politics of whether or not you like it, you know, we're talking about size. India is actually number 4, and Britain actually now is something like number 9, which is not the way we normally present ourselves to the world. But this has quite important public policy implications in terms of where our commercial policy externally should be directed. Because essentially this is the kind of underlying market size of the countries we happen to deal with. It affects debates around things like IMF and World Bank quotas. Anyway, I've just thrown this up as another example of how what I would regard as very seriously misleading statistics are guiding public policy in a very unhelpful way. So that's essentially pretty much what I want to say. I just make the point that we're not just talking about the UK. Other countries have serious problems with their statistics. China has buried quite a lot of awkward data about youth unemployment. The Indian Statistical Service, which used to be world class, has stopped collecting numbers pretty much for the last 10 years because they don't have the money. And there are now arguments about whether their GDP growth is 7% or 5%. It could be as widely different as that because of statistical collection issues. And as I've mentioned, these arguments about wealth taxation in developed countries are based on wildly different quality of statistical correction. So maybe I can just leave it there and follow up with question and discussion. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Vince. Should we have a few questions? Any questions for Vince first? Yes? Can you say who you are first, please?
I'm one of the Chinese students, actually came 20 years ago, and after 20 years I stayed. So I'm sure the Chinese government has a camera on me. Anyway, I just came back from a 3 weeks visit to China for recruitment purpose. So my question wasn't about the student number. My question was actually, in the city, for instance, Shenzhen, the city that very much familiar with, is a city that with a great public policy, and everything goes so fast. But one thing aided such efficiency is actually personal data. And I wonder, to what extent using personal data or incorporate personal data into public policy actually helped, or maybe unhelped, the efficiency of the society, or maybe even the statistic and transparency.
Well, maybe somebody in the room would like to. I don't think we worry too much about that in the UK. Obviously, it's an issue in China, right? The role of the state and the individual and data protection and privacy. I don't know, maybe somebody in the statistical universe would tell me, but is British data collection seriously inhibited by personal privacy questions? Because I think most of it's survey-based, right? So people may choose not to answer if they worry.
Yeah. But I would say, so if I may, that there is concern about how that personal data is used, and we have this big debate now in the National Health Service. So if that's what you meant, in terms of how you use that data, and I think there's somebody at the back who wants to come. Yeah, hi, of course.
I can say a bit. So James Benford, Director General for Surveys and Economic Statistics at the ONS. So on your question, there's a number of different aspects to it. So in terms of personal data, we have two main sources. One is our surveys, including the survey of everyone, the census, but we also do have access to government records too, for statistical purposes. One really important principle in the legal framework around statistics is that we can only use it for statistical use. We can't use it for operational use. We can't use the data to make a decision about one individual versus another individual just to draw inferences about the general population. And so there is that protection that's there in legislation. So that's what part of the answer to your question. We are, as many other countries are experiencing, suffering challenges getting people to respond to our surveys. In the UK, with the exception of the census, the surveys are voluntary. And since the pandemic, we have seen a change in relationship between the citizen and state, and people are less likely to respond. And that's an issue that's across countries. I think relates to trust in government and trust more broadly. It's something that we're working on. It's all right. Well, I've got the floor. Just wanted to just touch on one other thing that you mentioned, Sir Vince, in terms of the migration data. So you're quite right to point out the problems that we had with the survey at the border, ports on and airports and so on to kind of count migration. It doesn't work. It wasn't reliable. We've now replaced that system with administrative data on visa applications on the Home Office systems at the border, which is proved to be much more reliable, and we have revised back, and I can happy to share that data with you. For what it's worth, what that data shows is, in the near term, and this is from the visa system, around 40%, 50% of students stay after 3 to 5 years. That's what the visa system says, but happy to share that data with you if that would be useful. Just briefly on the wealth data, you're quite right too. There is an issue generally with wealth surveys that people with a lot of wealth don't like to reveal that in the surveys, and it's an area where we need to look at other sources like administrative data too, and we're working on that.
Yeah, I think the answer to your question is that there are problems with some of our citizens do actually think that some of their information is private to them, and they don't see why anybody else should have it at all. But others don't, and it depends. I think, thank you very much. If we just sort of move on if we can. Perhaps Fergal from the Bank of England will now tell us a little bit more about data for public policy as the Bank of England sees it. I'm reminding him there's no Chatham House rules, so I hope he's going to tell us something terribly secret, which you could all spread to the...
I think you can guarantee that is the one thing I will not do. Thank you very much, though, nonetheless, for inviting me here to this very impressive event in this very impressive location. My name is Fergal Shortall. I'm a director at the bank, and my role is leading the group of economists that support the MPC in setting interest rates. They did that yesterday, and I won't be saying anything about it. But my job is to ensure that they have the information they need to take their decisions now, and to anticipate what information they might need to take future decisions as well. So I'll speak from a monetary policy perspective here, because that's the lens I naturally bring, although the bank's other responsibilities in the financial stability and supervision area, of course, have their own data needs. From where we sit, data aren't an end in themselves. We don't consume statistics for their own sake. We use them as inputs to real-world policy decisions taken under uncertainty, often at turning points, and often with long and variable lags. So that means the key test for us is not whether the data is novel or elegant, it's whether it's useful. So let me start with inflation, because that's at the heart of our remit. We need an inflation measure that's well understood, that's trusted, broadly uncontested, and comprehensive in its coverage. That credibility matters enormously, not just for the bank, of course, but for public understanding, for accountability, and ultimately for policy effectiveness itself. It is the government that chooses the measure that we target, but we certainly agree that CPI is a good measure for that, but there are other measures that the government could also choose if they wanted to. In that context, the ONS quite rightly plays a central role. So high quality official statistics anchor the system and provide a common reference point for all of us in this room, for policymakers, for those in the general public. At the same time, official statistics are not the only sources of information that we use. Alongside them, we draw on business and consumer surveys, intelligence for our network of agents around the country who talk to businesses about what they're doing, financial market data, a range of new alternative sources. And that doesn't reflect any mistrust of official statistics. It reflects differences in aims. So it's partly this timeliness, accuracy trade-off that all national statistical institutions face. Official statistics rightly prioritize robustness and coherence, but policymakers also occasionally need earlier, sometimes noisier reads on what's happening in the economy. So that trade-off is just a feature of the system. A second implication of our remit is that we have to be inherently forward-looking because monetary policy takes time to work. So decisions taken that may affect inflation many quarters ahead are happening right now. So we can't rely solely on what inflation has done recently. We need some insight into what might be happening 12 to 24 months from now. A big part of our job, therefore, is signal extraction, so distinguishing short-term, high-frequency movements from more persistent pressures that matter for medium-term inflation. That's really hard in macroeconomics. We're talking about slow-moving processes that are subject to structural change all the time. That means it's very hard, necessary to do that that signal extraction problem. And what makes it very valuable in doing so is now allowing you to compare what's happening in this country with what might be happening in other countries undergoing similar phenomenon, meaning international comparability of statistics is very important too. Although our mandate is aggregate, disaggregated data is often essential too. So looking beneath the surface helps us understand how the behavior of different sectors, firms, regions, households work, how that feeds into the aggregate. And you'll see a lot of information, including in the monetary policy report that we published yesterday, on doing just that. It's also why understanding motivations matters so much. So to interpret movements in wages or in prices, you need insight into wage setting and price setting behavior, into costs, margins, and supply. Our DMP survey, which colleagues in this room are both familiar with and helped to design and run, is a good example of something where we sort of complement the data you might get on an aggregate basis on what's happening to inflation, on wage setting, on wages, with what firms saying, well, what's driving that? How uncertain are we? What are the factors that are leading into that? I do think it's important, I think I suspect you've already acknowledged, and I think Vince touched on it as well, is that this is a genuinely tricky time for producers of official statistics, not just in this country, but internationally. Survey responses have fallen. There is a pressure to integrate, as a result maybe, administrative data into surveys. That's an enormous challenge. Users, including policymakers, want faster data. We're very demanding. At the same time, expectations around alternative data have risen, and all that is happening naturally enough against a completely understandable focus on how much money we're spending on collecting and using it. So as users of the data, I'm sure that includes most of us here, we need to recognize that those pressures involve real trade-offs for data gatherers and for statisticians more broadly. I think against that backdrop, I just want to acknowledge some real good steps of progress that have been made. So Vince mentioned as well the day before survey. That is thankfully in a much better place now than it was a few years ago. The transition to the transformed LFS is approaching. We've also seen a reintroduction of producer price indices, scanner data now part of how we collect data on consumer prices, and work continuing on improving GDP methods. I think this event demonstrates my next point, which is that we're now working with an ONS that I think is much more open and engaged with users as well. From a policy user perspective, that openness really matters. It allows issues to be identified earlier, helps priorities be reassessed if they need to be, puts the system in a better position when challenges inevitably rise, and I'm sure they still will. I doubt we've discovered every single problem there might be with statistics construction today. So let me just say a few words finally about priorities from a monetary policy user perspective. In spite of the exciting alternative data sources we might have conceivably at our disposal, core surveys need to be sustained. They are the bedrock. If necessary, shored up. LFS, as I said, has received focus, but you can also perhaps think about the living cost and food survey, the wealth and asset surveys as other ones where in an ideal world we would work as put the same sort of effort as we have been able to so far into the LFS. Administrative data realistically are always going to be a complement rather than a substitute for surveys, but those surveys provide richness too on behavior, on structure and motivations that admin data ultimately can't really replace. Timely, usable, disaggregated and linked data is the next big challenge. We have some very big data sets out there. One of the reasons why those data sets haven't been linked just yet is the question we had just at the end of Vince's talk about personal data. There is rightly a focus amongst all official institutions about the basis on which they've collected that data and guarding and jealously ensuring that they are living up to the promises they made to the people who responded in terms of how they use that data. But inevitably, that puts limits on the extent to which data can be shared. And fourth, I think we need to continue investigating ways of understanding motivations and interpretation, whether that's through our decision maker panel survey I've mentioned already, agents intelligence. These are designed, I think, to interpret official data, not to replace it. I don't think that'll ever happen. Finally, data alone aren't enough. AI, machine learning, natural language processing, they open up all sorts of possibilities. I think we've only just begun to scratch the surface on all that. To do so, though, I think requires people and skills that are in short supply. I think we've found that data scientists are from Mars, economists are from Venus. Neither of them are from planet Earth, maybe, but the issue is they're not talking to each other. just yet. Data scientists know how to get big, fast data, but don't necessarily know what to do with it. We know what we would like to do with it, but can't find the data. So optimizing does require some meeting of minds here, and it requires sometimes those of us in the public sector competing in a very, very competitive labour market for skills that are in short supply. All right, so wrapping up, the goal from a policymaker perspective is not perfect data, it's data that helps us make better decisions at the right time with clarity about uncertainty. Thanks so much.
Yes. Just hand over to Ms. Vicky Pryce, who also talk about
Thank you.
statistics and public policy
Yes.
from her experience.
I know we're running out of time, and Tony is terribly strict about this. So I'll say a few things. Of course, I used to work. Well, I worked for a while for Vince at the time of the coalition government, and then of course we had austerity. After that, I had already gone. So it just makes one think about whether historical data and experience that we've all had, and all the information that already exists of what happens in various stages when you have austerity, what it actually means to the economy, and whether in fact, even though quite a lot of data comes to people who work in the government, who then advise the politicians, and I saw that of course earlier too with the Labour government, before the coalition vote, is that a lot of the data that exists that we present, we analyse and present, however imperfect it may be, very often gets ignored because of ideology. So of course, it is absolutely essential for us who are analysing it to be reasonably confident about what comes in. And in the department where I was, we had of course lots of statisticians. But we can't get all that information to be perfect, but even if it is imperfect, we have to be able to analyse it, to have historical data, and then express a view for a policy, which is really what we're talking about now, which is based on what the data is telling you. It could be ignored, as I said, but at least we've done our bit. But there is no doubt that the data itself can improve considerably, and it's not just ONS data, because of course we now depend hugely on consumer confidence indicators, what the British Chambers of Commerce put together as survey work, industrial trend surveys, and sometimes those surveys tell you something completely different about what's happening to the economy than what the ONS tells you. I've found this time and time again, for example, on the retail sales figures, where the British Retail Consortium will tell you one thing, and then you get the ONS data for the same month, and it's actually quite different. So right now, we have data for March that says actually people did spend quite a lot of money buying particularly fuel, but they spent quite a lot of money. And then we have information for April, which now tells you by the CBI that it is appalling. It's been the biggest collapse we've seen in ages. So we see what actually develops at the end of the day. So when you are in a position of crisis like we are now, then you start worrying about any of the data that you get and what it's actually telling you. We had a really interesting session earlier about goodwill and what happens to tech firms, which seem to be paying an awful lot of money to buy other companies which don't make any money for the time being, but then of course their value rises. We've had the Bank of England, one of the Bank of England deputy governors tell us that we're likely to get possibly, if we get a combination of an AI bubble, and then the geopolitics don't go our way. Look what's happened to oil prices just yesterday. And then we have private equity withdrawing from the market. What's going to happen to our growth ahead? And there could indeed be a huge drop in stocks. So the point of this is to say that a lot of the decisions that are made in a sphere of uncertainty. And we all have to judge what the data is really telling us underneath all this. And for that you need a lot of experience. You can't just sit there, collect data and say this is what it tells you, because you can't. And that's why I'm worried actually about some of the decisions that are being made. For example, yes, perhaps the Bank of England is looking forward. It now has scenarios. 3 scenarios were presented yesterday. You still have the European Central Bank saying we are going to make decisions which are going to be data dependent. What do we mean data dependent? Because whatever you get now, it's going to be out of the window by tomorrow, and also very often it's backward looking. So you need to be able to think ahead, exactly as we just heard from Fergal. Not everyone does that. I think the Fed has done it up to a point, and they're trying to tell us something. But what they tell us, that's the other important thing. And the way any decision is phrased, whether it's by the government or one of the banks, central banks, has an influence on the mood. So it's also linked. So just be careful what you say and how you say it. And I do remember working for the government during the financial crisis, and it's not Chatham House, you said, but never mind. So Mervyn King was, of course, the governor of the Bank of England, and he had his bonnet about not assisting companies that were in difficulty or banks. So the moral hazard issue. And of course he'd say moral hazard, and we'd all sort of put our heads in our hands and say, don't say this again, that will lead to a collapse of what's going on in the market. And then I remember one time he went off to Israel during the sort of crisis as it was really sort of beginning. And we said, oh good, he's not going to talk about moral hazard for a bit. And he gave a speech and talked about moral hazard. And everything went sort of belly up again. So the way that decisions are expressed is really important for politicians because it affects consumer confidence, business confidence, and so on. But then again, we've got this other problem. Do we actually know what happens to productivity? There is a big, big obsession right now with productivity because, of course, we want growth. And how you approach this whole issue, we touched on it earlier, matters hugely in terms of what the policy outcomes are and therefore what happens to the economy. So, for example, just look at the national insurance contributions increase that took place in the first budget. That not only did it raise employers' national insurance contributions overall, but it also reduced the threshold. What does it do if you reduce the threshold to the 5,000 that it's been reduced to for employers? It means that loads of low-paid people, women, part-time workers, and young people after university, because it doesn't apply to anyone below 21 years of age, find it much more difficult to get a job. And then that leads into more mental health issues, needs, and so on. So one of the really important things of a government advisor is to look at policy and warn the policymakers of the unintended consequences of what they're doing. We don't always get listened to, and I was a government advisor for quite some time. Occasionally I get given directions saying, we don't care, we're not going to hold you responsible, you really got to do what we say we want you to do. But we all know about the consequences, and then people say, oh my God, look what's happened. Well, it was all there, written down. So anyone can go back and check that this were actually told. Now, the final thing, of course, what you measure matters. And given that we measure GDP, we talked about GDP earlier, the very first talk, we do, of course, miss a huge amount of what's going on in the economy, which is all the volunteering that's taking place, all the work done by women looking after their elderly parents, and so because it doesn't get monetized. And of course, we as economists only really look at, and the statisticians, what you can monetize and value it. So a third of the GDP of the economy is not being measured. But if there is any change in behavior, people decide that I don't want to volunteer anymore, I need to go out and get some money, or I'm not going to do it, so someone else is going to have to do it for whom you, government, pay to look after the elderly people, or in the NHS. I'm not going to go out and raise all this money for cancer research, but someone else is going to have to pay for it. Then it changes the economy quite considerably. And again, the types of incentives given, the type of recognition given. This is why there is a big debate. I've debated against Vince on universal basic income, for example. Once I was sort of in favour, and he was very sensibly against it. But all these things matter in terms of how the economy can move ahead. And we do have, therefore, to be constantly forward-looking, but having a base of good statistics, nevertheless, and historical data we can trust, like we've just been hearing about the problems with overseas students, is an absolute must, because otherwise it's just guesswork. So this is why I support this organisation. I sit on the board of Better Statistics, because we want that to be better. Whether it's going to lead necessarily to better policy, I think goes back to the politicians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky and everybody. Questions, please. We've got some time. I don't think the last session won't be that big. Yes, sir. Name, please.
Back in June 23, as somebody who spent his life in employment services with public companies, I was very surprised when the Bank of England said there was a hot jobs market. It took me a year to prove the point that there wasn't a hot jobs market. The only place that there was a hot jobs market was that the public sector was recruiting hand over fist. And it took a lot of going back through old statistics, coming out of the ONS, for me to be able to prove the point. And then it relates back to something that's been, as far as I'm concerned, not touched on today, which is that the public sector has been hiring hand over fist. I don't know what other areas it's been spending an awful lot of money, but there doesn't seem to be any great effort to distinguish as to what is in the private sector and what is in the public sector. Because I would argue that the private sector employment was some time ago hit really hard, long before the NI. And if I wore my SME owner hat, I just need to look at the difficulties that we've had there and the inability, for example, of, I guess, the politicians to recognise that when the bank says there is inflation, we have a commitment there, for example, not to put up our rates more than the rate of inflation. But with employment costs, energy and food being our greatest, we had double-digit inflation on those over the last 18 months. And that's not measured in the official statistics. So I see this yearning gap between what is actually out there in the real world, what is experienced, particularly from an employment point of view, and then what I've been listening to today.
So there's a lot of truth to the labour market picture that the gentleman described. It's absolutely true that the private sector labour demand weakened a lot earlier than public sector labour demand. But public sector and private sector are competing in the same labour market for the same people. So it will have been the case that strong public demand for labour will have made it harder for the private sector to recruit. And it's that overall tightness and looseness in the labour market that will have been focused on, regardless of who's doing the hiring.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Yes. Question? Yeah.
Yeah, Bernie Case. I want to pick up a point that Fergal made and that I found interesting, and this was the pressure to integrate survey data and admin data, and pressure to recognise the quality of admin data. In another context, we can think of things which were unduly rushed.
For those who couldn't hear, he was picking up on the fact that Fergal had said earlier that there had been some pressure to bring administrative data and survey data together, and it may have been a bit rushed. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I'm sure we were definitely one of the people putting pressure. In an ideal world, yes, you would be able to integrate survey data and administrative data and maybe make up for a little bit of some of the inevitable falling short of survey data, of survey responses, maybe with administrative data, but they're not the same thing. They're not quite measuring the same thing, and you need to be careful and cautious in doing that. That's partly our job as interpreters of data to do that. It's not necessarily for the ONS to be the final decision taker on that, but I think they both have their place, and in an ideal world with unlimited resources, both will be fully available.
My question was, do you feel this is unduly rushed? Because I have been to a large number of events recently, in the last year or so, where this is forever being put upon the table. And I don't know, but I kind of get the impression that some of these statistical authorities are under pressure, if we'll accept those terms, to do more of this than is perhaps justifiable on the basis of A, the information we've got, and B, the way we can integrate it at all.
I'm sure the ONS only has a limited budget and needs to think hard about where it puts its limited resources. I welcome the increased focus they've put over the last couple of years in terms of shoring up the key building blocks of their official macroeconomic data, particularly those main surveys that underpin it. I think in an ideal world and over time, we will complement that with a large range of admin data as well.
If I may comment, it's very, very interesting that there are no actual descriptions anywhere of anybody actually trying to integrate the data. The ONS itself hasn't published anything methodologically on how it's put together tax data with other. Sorry, well, it's been difficult to find in the methodology things. And certainly we, Better Statistics, some of us have had experience of looking at administrative data and survey data on the part of major international clients. We have the experience of, I've myself not seen the body of evidence that says these are best methods. This is what, and if you consider it just in general terms, and I'm sure we do, all of us, really, you know, the tax system, the IDBR has been around for well over 20 years. To only now, recently, in the last few years, we're really trying to integrate the tax data with the, it's just an astonishing why wait so long. And they're still having, it seems to me, difficulties. I was personally astonished, and I'm sure we'll come back to it a little later, by the statement that there are something like 27 different data sets from the tax system that the ONS are dealing with. I would very much like an explanation as to why there are so many. But this is a very crucial area, and it's one that, as far as I'm aware, hasn't technically been solved with proper understood procedures which are general use, Venn diagrams of where the overlap really exists and where one data may be greater than another. Methodologically, it's very, very crucial to get this right. But I've got, if I may, a question, just a final one, for all three of you. It's very clearly, you know, data is important to illuminate policy decisions. But to what extent, Vince, have you, like a lot of the businessmen I've ever dealt with, you can handle them all the data in the world, but their instinct is and was, we'll go with this, and they go ahead, and they're generally okay, even if you happen to be providing data which isn't that accurate or good or whatever. So to what extent, Vince, were you able to make your decisions, your policy decisions, almost irrespective of data? Did you not feel capable of doing that at all, or what?
No, I like to think we were evidence-driven and
Right.
decision-making, but maybe this was a rare outpost in government.
But I wasn't there at the time. But there's quite a lot that happens before. So for example, if the government is obsessed with getting growth, and they talk about productivity, you then need to remind them that you can get growth by just having more people working as well. So there is a constant reteaching of ministers and secretaries of state, not of course Vince, of basic economics and how things work. But I have seen a number of decisions made by, as I was saying earlier, by government, which have been done on ideology or instinct and not based on the evidence because it didn't suit them. That happens all the time, so we know that. But our job is to limit this from happening. But there is also an issue, if I may, that some of the data that we get, we can't even say ourselves what it is. For example, the construction data. So I have a bee in my bonnet about construction data, which for some reason the Department for Business was responsible for a long time. I mean, it wasn't an ONS thing, it was the Department for Business one. Like some of the trade statistics which come from the department as well. And it was so bad that we got these revisions constantly. And the revisions for GDP for the quarter, because there weren't any monthly ones then, we've talked about all that this morning, were so great that we just had difficulty explaining it to the ministers. What is going on in the economy? Since suddenly, you know, what we thought was happening and therefore policy was set together was thrown out of the window. So I took this momentous decision to hand it to the ONS and therefore not be responsible for the fact that those construction statistics were so bad. And amazingly, perhaps not thinking, they accepted it. And they've been pretty bad ever since.
I'm sure that the Bank of England would never ever go without evidence, would it?
Well, we're not allowed instincts at the Bank of England, so we only rely on evidence.
Only
As best we can.
only the captain of the ship.
We have to be forward-looking, of course. There's a metaphor about setting monetary policy. It's like driving a car by only looking for the rear view window, and it does feel like that sometimes.
Yeah,
but that does mean judgment sometimes is definitely necessary to try and extract the signal from the data.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much, all of you. Thank you. Hand over now to the next chair, Phyllis from Better Statistics. And
Okay, I'm Phyllis Macfarlane. I built my career on measuring business markets because nobody knew how to do it at the time, and so Tony and I were allowed to make it up as we went along. It was always a problem to measure small businesses. Fortunately, at the time, small businesses were more homogeneous, and they didn't have any money to buy the sort of products we were researching, which were big copiers and computers. And so the fact that we perhaps didn't measure them very accurately probably didn't matter. You have to remember, in 1976, when we bought our first mini computer, it cost £30,000, and that was the price of an average London house. And you'd probably buy it for 3 and 6pence now, to give the power that it had. But I was always extremely jealous of countries like France and Sweden that had proper business registers until I started working with them, because then you realise that at the bottom end, small business registers are generally extremely inaccurate because they're full of paper companies and things that have disappeared, and 100 companies registered to the same lawyer and all that sort of thing. So I'm delighted that Philip, who's our first speaker, is going to tell us about the progress they're making building a good business register in the UK. So I'll let him take over and talk for himself. And he's got, I think he's probably got the most difficult job in the world, so you do have my sympathy.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to talk a little bit about the new register that we're developing. James alluded to it this morning. I'll also talk a little bit about our engagement strategy and the sort of the other elements that we've got within our business survey strategy as well. But I'll focus on the engagement as well, particularly around that small business side. So the current database that we have has around 3 million businesses. We take mainly data from VAT and pay, and then we combine that with some companies' house data to create our enterprises and our units, basically. Now, the SBR, the new Statistical Business Register, will take that, but what we will do in addition is actually use that full company's house population. So we will generally then add companies that aren't registered for VAT and pay. So that will add around another 2.5 million businesses to that register. So, a much more comprehensive coverage of the micro businesses as well. They will be small, as I said, but something that we're able to do then is think about how do we exploit that. So currently, obviously, we have various size bands. So the 0 to 9s in particular, we will expect to see that growth. So thinking about how we use that going forward will be key. We're also looking with HMRC to use their self-assessment data. We're still negotiating with HMRC to have access to that. But that, again, will give us more information, particularly around sole traders and partnerships. So again, a much more comprehensive view of the business population. There are a couple of things that we're looking to do longer term within the strategy. One is to reduce the number of surveys, again, as James talked about this morning. So reduce our overall survey portfolio, try and reduce the burden that we're placing on the businesses that we asked to complete for us. There's a big piece around engagement, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing with some of our larger businesses and how we can learn from that. And then I guess the last pillar is really around how we automate. How do we get to a stage where we can receive data from businesses in a much more or much less manual way? So how do we automate that process going forward? So in terms of engagement, lots of things we're doing. So you hopefully have seen today that Tony's talked about our engagement survey that's out on our Citizen Space website. Still got time to complete that if you haven't. There's some emerging themes coming from that James covered. But part of that then is what we do next. So it's about We've asked companies that want to engage with us to let us contact them, and we've started to do that already. So there's a sort of a route in there as well. We have something for a larger and more complex businesses called the large case unit. And James also mentioned that about the account management. And that's really a way of working with our really complex businesses. If you're a very large business, you might get almost every one of our surveys, which could sort of total almost 600 questionnaires a year. That's allowed us to really think about how we engage. What's the lessons that we learn from that. That's partly around, I think we've touched on this already today, is around that communication. How do we better inform businesses as to why we want their data, why it's really important, how we use it. There's obviously a sliding scale. It's much easier for those larger businesses to do that, but we've got to find a way of really engaging with that smaller business community. We've got to upskill. So some of the contact that you'll have with our organisation, we're looking to upskill internally. So how do we get a much better contact so you have less opportunity to have to call back or to re-ask for that data? How do we design our surveys? We have a research team that looks at how we structure our surveys, what questions we ask. We've done a bit of research with our annual surveys for hours and earnings. That does rely on businesses wanting to engage with us. And again, it's a question I'll come back to at the end. But that allows us to take the businesses through the questions that we ask, what works. We have accountants that we brought in from the real world that help us translate some of the language in terms of our questions so that the questions we ask, companies understand. And then we design the survey in a way that means that obviously we try and get the best quality data from them. So it's really about high quality data and that best respondent experience. We moved onto a digital platform. I mean, COVID really accelerated our move from paper surveys onto digital. Now that won't suit everybody, but the vast majority of our businesses that we engage with want some form of digital survey opportunities. So that speeds things up. Hopefully it's less burden, it's less bureaucratic as well. So there's things that we're doing within that space as well. So I think for me today, one of the questions we'd really like to engage with them, and I think we acknowledge that, for some of our larger businesses, we've got a much better engagement because of the model and the size of the companies. But how do we engage with that smaller business? How do we work with you as we expand the business register and we look to exploit that? James talked about the new industrial classifications. As they become part of our plans going forward, how do we engage with that community to make it less burdensome for you, but at the same time get the highest quality data for the important statistics that we've all talked about this morning. I think I'll park it there.
Thank you, yes. Thank you. And I've got exactly the man for you to answer those questions. So Ian represents the Microbusiness Alliance, and he has a lot of opinions about what he can do to help you. But it's worth saying that, somebody said this morning that small business is only a small part of GDP, but it's a large part of employment. And one of the reasons why we set up business statistics was a feeling that there was probably more growth in the small businesses that were perhaps not being registered. And basically we wanted to check that small businesses were being represented properly. But great progress you're making, but Ian's the man to tell you, really.
I wouldn't say that.
Why not?
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, no, what was somebody said the definition of an expert, an ex was a has-been and a spurt was a drip under pressure. So, no, hopefully, I know why I'm here. I'm here because I turned up at a meeting when it was announced at the ONS that pretty much they weren't getting any data from micro businesses at all. And that's a concern. So you got me. I'm suffering a bit from imposter syndrome. I'm not a statistician. I'm not an expert on the numbers, statistics and all the rest of it. What I am is a generalist. I know quite a lot about on quite a wide area because I deal with micro businesses every day. That's my playground. That's what I'm doing every day. When I'm not at things like this, somebody talked earlier this morning about walkarounds. That's what I'm doing. I'm walking around with micro businesses, talking to them every day, and they're generalists as well. You know, and any of you that run a micro business know that. You're trying to be the HR director, the sales manager, the marketer, the HR director, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all. That's the nature of the micro business sector. But we shouldn't devalue it. The micro business sector for me is very, very important. There isn't a big business out there that didn't start in that sector. And I could bore you for hours. You know, Jack Cohen, Tesco, started off in a market stall, one-man band. And I could rattle off examples of that. Some want to scale up, a lot of them don't. But those micro businesses, 0 to 9 employees, make up about 75% of the businesses in the UK economy. And the Micro Business Alliance currently works with about 1.2 million of them. So I'm talking to quite a few of them and getting their feedback. One concern that I have on the downside for micro businesses, Liz was at a thing with me at Barclays head office on Canary Wharf. The confidence in the UK economy within that sector is running at 13%. That's bloody awful. That's not a good place to be, and we've got to do something to turn that around. But micro businesses are very important, and I think getting increasingly important, and I'll tell you why. Because that 0 to 9 employees, you've got a lot of businesses out there that used to be bigger, that were 20 or 30 people strong, but they're not now. You've got significant businesses with only maybe 8 employees, and then they outsource the technology. Somebody's doing the website, somebody's doing the social media. How many of you are actually using AI at the moment? Quick show of hands. How many of you have got an AI agent that works independently of you? Couple. Yeah, I've just gone through that process myself. Why is AI important to micro businesses? I've now got an AI agent called Lemmy, after Lemmy Kilminster in Motorhead. And that agent basically every day is going out doing research. I've also got a training company called Jack in the Box, looks at creativity and innovation. Lemmy goes out every day, looks at all the information that's going out in the big wide world about creativity and innovation, picks the best stories, summarises them on one page, gives them to me, and I've fed into Lemmy what my presentations look like. So Lemmy also produces the PowerPoint slides for me, so that when I get up in the morning, if I want to slot them in and use them, I can do. That's me as a one-man band micro business. That's why AI is important to me. It's freed up 6 hours, I reckon, a week. And that's 6 hours, rather than doing a load of rote tasks with my head down, I've got to do right brain thinking about strategy, where my business goes and all the rest of it. So it's really, really important. And I mentioned earlier this morning when I said about change, it's being driven by AI, by robotics and by nanotechnology. Those 3 things in the next 10 years will make huge differences to us. Things we thought was science fiction. Somebody told me the other day they'll be able to replace 10% of the blood cells, the red blood cells in your body, with nano cells that are more oxygen efficient. You'll be able to run, basically sprint for 15 minutes on one breath. Sit at the bottom of a swimming pool for 4 hours on one breath. But more importantly for me, if you had a heart attack, and I'm getting into Sniper Alley now, you know, usually heart stops, brain starved of oxygen, you're dead. The body would have 8 hours to get to the hospital because the oxygen efficient cells would keep you going. Sounds like science fiction. They say they'll have that in 10 years. Whether it'll be open to us, I don't know. Probably only Elon Musk will be able to afford to have it. But that rate of change that's going on in the micro business market means that micro business owners have already recognised that change is this ongoing thing, and my God, it's happening at pace. So I'm not firing a sniper rifle anymore at that target. I don't need exact data to get things perfect to aim at that target. I need enough data to know that I'm going in the right direction, and then I'm able to pick up the opportunities along the way when I go. Micro businesses have made that change. Unfortunately, a lot of our, well, government will be a great one, but you know, a lot of our institutions haven't recognised that and aren't changing at pace. And they tinker and they put regulation in. Now, I am going to pick on one, you know, the hospitality industry. Everybody knows, just as an example, you know, we all know that the hospitality industry is under pressure. Yeah, loads of pubs closing, it's made the press and all the rest of it. But that stems from my point of view, going back to the beer orders in 1989, I think it was, when the government said you could only have 2,000 pubs. The idea was you only have 2,000 pubs, so the rest will get sold off and we'll have a wonderful free trade like we have in Europe. And also there was things about guest beers and the rest of it. What they didn't foresee is a load of brewers went, hang on a minute, where's the money in brewing beer or in the property estate that we've got? Oh, the property estate. Sod that, we'll close the brewery down. So Greenall Whitley on my doorstep, so did so many others. Any of you know Burton-on-Trent that had, Bass, Whitbread, all the big brewers, they're all gone. Most of them are now foreign companies, Whitbread concentrated on hotels and coffee shops. So that tinkering led to these big retail groups appearing, like Punch and Enterprise, that don't brew beer, don't own pubs, but they were allowed to operate the tie, which meant that any of you take a pub on, not only have you got to pay me the rent for it, but you've got to buy everything that you sell in your pub through me at a premium price. Tell me another business where you could get away with that one. That's why the pubs are closing, because basically the vast majority of them are owned by property companies. The fact that their pubs, that their properties sell beer and wines and spirits is an inconvenience to them. Actually, if it closes down and I get change of use, it's probably worth more because it's a pub with a car park and a beer garden and a bowling green and get 12 houses on that, or turn it into a Tesco local or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is the root problem was that tinkering and the unexpected that went on. Now, did they do anything to address that when they saw the market changes? No. It took them until 2003, 14 years later, before they changed that before they basically scrapped that piece of regulation because the changes were made. And Sir Vince will have been involved in the pubs code that was brought in. Well, you wouldn't have needed a pubs code for the regulated pub companies if they'd got this right. So one of the things is this idea that we do regulation, we pass it down, we've got it perfect, we put it out there, but we don't review it for 4 years. I mean, how ridiculous, because you get something out there with the rate of change, the chances are, in some cases, 12, 18 months down the line, the thing that you've done is just not fit for purpose anymore. We should be designing things that can evolve and change and keep up with the rate of change. So I've had my bit of a rant. I told you I started the reason. Well, just one more point. I'm here because there was that comment about micro businesses aren't engaging. Okay, Liz said something earlier about, they're going to sit there, what's in it for me? Because why would I fill it in? Now, there's no feedback loop when you're asking for data. If I'm training somebody in my company, I get them, I train them, I let them get out there, I provide them feedback, they grow, and you've got that growing cycle. You're expecting people to give data, and the micro businesses never see it. So why the bloody hell should I do it? Who reads it? I never get any feedback. Nobody tells me what's gone on with it. Did it make any difference? So what I'd be doing, and this is just my opinion, I'm not saying it's right, but one of the things you could do, why isn't somebody looking at the data that you're collecting, putting it into a format that micro businesses can understand, where you're going, right, the data says roughly this is what's going on, here's a direction of travel, this is what it means to you, and here's some actions that you can take that you're going to benefit from that in the feedback loop. And by the way, if you keep answering our surveys, you'll get more of this good stuff that'll help you in your business, and you can sectorise it. So finishing on a positive, for me, one of the main things that's missing at the moment is you're collecting data off people, but you're not giving them anything back. You're not giving them a reason for doing it. And for micros in particular, who are those jacks of all trades and generalists like myself, that's what you need. So I hope you found that useful. Thank you.
Yeah. My father was a farmer, and he was famous. He always got into eggs when the egg price was about to go down, and he always got more into sheep when the sheep price went down. He only ever joined in anything at the peak of the market. But anyway, he did quite well. But Ian's point is absolutely right. It's about communication, isn't it? And it's about appropriate communication that people can use in their own way, not telling them go into eggs or go into beef or go into pigs this week. It's information that the market seems to be doing this and prices are doing that. So I think that's one of the key things we should discuss later or even now. So who's got a question? Bernard.
Yeah, years ago and in another incarnation, I engaged in quite a lot of research. It was often amongst companies to try and find out what companies were doing about this, that or the other. And so one was having to win an acceptable level of participation. Now these companies could have been smaller as well as large ones. One of the things that one used to do in those days was to sort of offer the respondents, yes, you can see what we have done. We actually didn't usually get very much of an answer back and say, yes, I would like to see this. But one of the things which I even noticed today is that an awful lot of people sort of want to know, what should we do? And once you get into the question of what should we do, and you're telling them that, you have a certain responsibility as well, because they're going to turn on you on the basis that if it didn't work out, it's all your fault. I do wonder, however, whether one might be able to construct something which one can feed back, which possibly gives people a very few sort of metrics which say, how are you doing relative to your sector? How are you doing relative to other people like you? And would that be a kind of payback which people, it's not telling you you ought to be doing anything, you've got to make all the decisions, but it is a sort of payback which might be relatively easy to do from, let's say, the surveyor's point of view, from the ONS. It is, of course, a cost, an additional cost, and you have to work out whether, in fact, it is going to generate, let's say, more and better returns. But at least it gets you off the responsibility, because in the course of today, I've heard very many people say, we want to know what to do, and somehow expecting that statistics is going to tell them what to do, and that made me feel very uncomfortable.
I think that's a very good point. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great idea. I think the challenge around, there's a couple of challenges. I think there's a challenge around burden. So I think we've heard today, but we want more involvement. Also, that comes with burden. So how do we manage that from a sort of a relationship perspective? Because if we're asking more, then that will require more, I guess, more support from the businesses. I mean, looking at that individually, I think is quite a challenge. I mean, whether we can do something at a sector level, possibly, I think. But again, there's a timing. It's about how quickly we can do that, how much resource it takes, and how valuable that becomes. So I think, without trying to give an answer here and now, it's something we can certainly think about. I think we'd like, we did some work with the US around when they changed some of their large surveys, and they did a piece around playing back, what it meant for your particular local geography or your sector, for example. I think that was more of a sort of an annual piece of work rather than a sort of a just-in-time approach. But so there are examples of that being done, and how we find somewhere where that maybe is workable. Look at James later for budget maybe, but we can certainly take away the idea. I think it's a starting point.
It's certainly better than, as you say, advising people and them or the whole sector doing the same thing, which is probably not a good thing. And as you say, taking responsibility. What do you think, Ian?
The other thing I'd say is I'd never tell anybody what to do.
Exactly.
Okay, so you don't do that. But what you can say is, here's some things that you could do. Well, you say that, but that's what, and I'm sure I know the gentleman here from the FSB as well. I know we work in a similar way. We get shared a lot of regulation under Charterhouse rules beforehand, so we can prepare for when it's coming. And you'll talk to members. So the thing about the walk around, right, this is going to happen, this is what's going on. How would you deal with that? And then turn it into stories told by other small and micro business, because they don't like listening to experts, but by God, they'll listen to Fred up the road who's got a garage or whatever. So you turn it into stories. This is what so-and-so did. So you're not telling anybody what to do, but what you're saying is, here's some things that you could do that would make that process easier. Here's some ways that you could use those statistics. If that direction of travel's right, here's some stuff you could do. You're not telling them what to do, you're giving them Yeah,
possibilities.
There's a big difference there. You're a membership organisation in a sense, and you're advising your members, and that's fine. But that's something which is completely different from the ONS. I mean, that's a very...
But the ONS doesn't have to do the feedback, because the ONS might not feel comfortable with that. What the ONS could do is give us the data and the stories, and trade bodies could do it for them. We could sectorise it. You know, there's enough trade bodies out there that could help to do that communication. Nobody says that the ONS have to do it all on their own. They could work in partnership with others, which I believe is one of the points later on that we're finishing off on the day, is how we work in partnership. And I think that's one of the things you could do.
And you heard that offer. We'll remember that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Richard at the back. Sorry.
Yes, just as part of this debate, if you search Google for ONS Productivity Ready Reckoner, you'll find a little app on our website where you pop in your sales, your purchases, your number of staff, and your sector, and it will tell you where you lie in the distribution of firms in your sector, which isn't quite giving advice, but is definitely contextualising information that I hope people might find useful and is a step in this direction.
It is, yeah. That's nice. It's the sort of thing once you find out about you do use. Yeah.
Just wanted to add on Richard's point, we also have, not to sound too doom and gloom, but we also do a publication annually and a quarterly publication called Business Demography, which looks at the births and deaths within the business register. And you can sort of look at it by sector and industry, so it gives you information. Again, just looking at what the trend is.
Yeah.
But that's available as well on our website if you search for that.
I know, but we're all terrible, aren't we, at looking for... I always say, I didn't know that, and it's my fault, really. Sorry.
Thank you. I think the thing is, there is already a lot of feedback, payback. It's just not that granular. And I don't think it could be. For one thing, you'd be offending data privacy. Some companies will not want other companies to know how they're doing. Secondly, every time we have a major announcement from ONS, we'll have similar announcements or views expressed by 40 or 50, I don't know how many different economic institutes that are publishing surveys, opinions, that there's going to be a recession of 1% over the next 2 months, 5 months, whatever. And somebody else says, no, it's going to be the other way around, and nobody really knows what's happening. But the thing is, the feedback in there is telling some company directors, you know what, this is really looking bad. We cannot afford to expand. And that, in a sense, is a reinforcement loop problem. I think small and large companies are probably going to have to just accept that giving information to ONS on a confidential basis is still worth their while, because it makes it easier for ONS to provide back in general, not in a granular nature, information which might be worth having, may not be.
Yeah.
Which is all well and good, but you've got a problem. I told you why I was here in the first place. You know, I'm not usually in this field. You know, you're sitting telling me, statistical people, that you're not getting any data off micro businesses. So definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So you can keep going as you are, but you're still not going to engage the micro businesses. What I gave you was one suggestion. You're going to have to find a way of changing things if you're going to get those micro businesses engaging, because at the moment, not interested and not doing it. It's as simple as that. So you're going to have to do something.
Yeah, but a lot of what Philip's doing, which is automating and digitising, I mean, when I read those plans, which I did read, you know, that will make things easier for them, won't it?
Well, we hope so. I think, and this is part of the key. I think, you know, this is across our suite of surveys, so we are looking to do that. I think the point around security is really important, though. I think, you know, when we collect our data, obviously it's held in trust. When we publish data, it's anonymised. And there's obviously things like disclosure that you wouldn't be able to necessarily go down to a level that means your data you could work out somebody else's data from that as well. So there's a whole range of things that we'd have to abide by in order, obviously, to protect the data and keep it safe. But So I think these are some of the things that we need to work through and challenge ourselves on.
Yeah, but you're doing the right things, I think. So, any other questions? I mean, I think if there aren't, I mean, I think one of the things that Tony and James are going to have to address is communication. How do you actually get people trusting things well enough to fill in the surveys? What is that mechanism? Whose responsibility is it? I think is a very, very key question. What is it and whose responsibility is it? Anyway, Tony, I've caught up time. Where's he gone? I've caught up your time for you. Thank you very much indeed.
It's teamwork. It's teamwork. Now, I remind you that James also said they send out and they're in touch with 300,000 businesses a year, and he's had 64 responses to his survey. Now, in parallel with the survey that the Office of National Statistics did, Better Statistics did a survey with the assistance of our major institutions, organisations, that's the CBI, the Institute of Directors, the Federation of Small Businesses, the Microbusiness Alliance, and an organisation that few people have heard of called IPSI, which is the Independent Practitioners and Self-Employed. I can't remember what the P stands for now, very bad of me. Anyway, they all had their own URLs to invite their own members, and I also sent an invitation to a group of people that I'm in touch with. Now, as a response rate, because I don't know how many members there are, it's one of the secrets that the FSB, Rick there, may reveal now, or Ian might reveal how many members he has. The IID did reveal to me that they had 20,000. Unfortunately, Anna Leach from the IID is very, very nice lady, well, was unable to come today, so she's not talking. The CBI, who are very, very cooperative, but they don't have that many members. Anyway, I'm sure that it doesn't add up to anything like 300,000. If you add them all together, it's probably about 50,000, but it depends. The Microbusiness Alliance may have any. However, let me just confess. He got 64 out of 300,000. I got 28 out of I don't know how many. So I'm sorry that I'm not here to analyse my 28 responses. Some of them, what they've written in, is definitely of interest, but much of what they suggested has actually been discussed here today. There's one really interested me, which I think I'd like to sort of pose to our panel here, which is the question the young lady asked to some extent, which is the matter of privacy, of, should we be telling the state about our things? And one of the questions I thought was a nice one to ask in the Better Statistics survey to the businesses was about the extension of the gross domestic product into well-being measures, which our friend down there, Richard Hayes, is actively working on year in, year out very well. And the person responded, the state knows already too much about me, why should they know anything about my well-being? And I thought that was a very interesting question to put forward. Anyway, that's it. That's the level of response that 2 online surveys got from British business today. That was the framework of reference for the whole day, really, is how do we actually get better communication between the two? Now, from listening, and I have been listening a little bit to what's been said, clearly the matter of communication is key. And I was very interested by Richard Hayes' comment earlier about, well, if you go on Google and look up productivity, you can get and do your own and find out where you stand. And I thought, well, how wonderful, It's a very good fact that if I want to find out anything on the ONS site, I go to Google because I won't get it from the ONS site. So just, sorry, James, I'm not really here to put you on any kind of spot because you've been excellent hitherto, but, who cares about the future? We're not going to do another one of these next week. So, please, when Better Statistics started about 5 years ago, one of the very first things I wrote, I don't know, I think it was I think it was actually to the then National Statistician, Saria, and I mentioned the website as being a bit of a problem. And 5 years later, I don't think there's very much to, but follow the advice of Richard down there. Use Google and you'll find out more about our statistics that way. Anyway, questions? Relationships. How do we improve them? How are we going to help the Office of National Statistics to collect information from this larger group of people, going from a population of 3 million to 4.5 to 5 million? Badly needed. We need to understand more about our economy. Business, we believe ourselves, would benefit from having better data. But how do we do it? Do we have to use telephone methods as well as online? Can we cope just with online? That's a question for you all, please.
Just on.
Yeah, just you. Rick first, from the FSB.
Hi. Yes, first of all, to feedback on our membership size, I don't know exactly, but I believe it's somewhere between 1 and 200,000.
Really?
So we might be closer to the 300,000. So represented.
Well, my response rate really is poor. Or
I'll
your
come
help.
on to that in a moment. I wanted to, first of all, stress the point that it is vital to include small businesses and micro businesses and the self-employed. It's easy to pass them off as kind of a long tail, but they are the vast majority of all businesses. They are the majority of all jobs, and I think by a small amount they're the majority of revenue. So the representation of that proportion is very important, not least because representation is also representation is equality. By representing those small businesses, we are able to include all their interests, and all the things that small businesses do better than big businesses get accounted for as well. So small businesses are much better, and micro businesses obviously are much better at employing those further from the workforce. They're much better at often at adapting swiftly to new environments and to testing new ideas, and so including them is important. I think so. We've heard today, excellently put by Ian and by Liz Barclay also, that small businesses, micro businesses, they doing so much to run their business. They are jacks of all trades, frantically trying to do every job. And so the amount of time that they have to fill in surveys and to feedback on these things is really, really limited. And so there are, as I see it, there's two sides to that equation. And we've talked a bit about how they could get more out of it, trying to give them more information back, trying to make it more worthwhile for them in some way. If you ask them, they would say cash incentive would be the best, but I recognise there's probably a limit to the possibility of that. The alternative, I think, is by making it much lower effort. Rather than spending half an hour filling out a complex, lengthy survey, if there's a way for them to consent to their data from some other source being used, or if there's lower effort ways of them sharing their information with you, they're more likely to, because small businesses, they do recognise the benefit of government knowing about their issues. They engage with us because we advocate on their behalf, so we're able to get good survey response rates. I think that's the secret to how we've been able to consistently get reasonable rates of response to our surveys. But they do that because they can see that it will help them and others. They're, despite being the average business, they're not mean with their time. They are willing to invest in it, but they need they need it to be as efficient as possible and of as much value to them as possible. That's what I would say.
So what kind of response rate do you actually get now, Rick? Or is it, you have a panel anyway, don't you?
It varies enormously. So we have our we have our quarterly survey, which gets a strong response rate, and then in the months between the quarterly survey, we have thematic surveys, and they vary wildly depending on how interesting and relevant they are to individuals. So we just closed a survey on settling disputes, which is a slightly niche subject, which is only relevant to people who've maybe had a dispute or are in the midst of a dispute. So it was a lower response rate on that one. The survey before that was about banking, which we're worried people would be cagey about because it's asking personal information, but they were very forthcoming and we got a really good response rate. We have a panel as well, like you said. So of our members, there's a group of 1,000 or 2,000 who are really strong responders and who don't mind us storing their profiling data as well. So it saves them time every time they fill in the survey. They don't need to fill in the basics about their age and gender and so forth. And they have a much higher response rate for us. So they end up making up about a third of our response, even though they make up a fraction of our membership. Our response rate, it varies a lot, but we aim for around 1,000. 1,000 per survey is a good response. The SBI, our quarterly survey, gets somewhat better than that. We also, because we often then look at the data quite granularly, we try and avoid analysing anything where we have fewer than 50 responses. So, for instance, often in our reports, you'll see that we're unable to report the results for Northern Ireland, for instance, where we have less membership representation than we do in the rest of the UK, and therefore, we often don't manage to get 50 responses from Northern Ireland. We're working on that, though.
Oh, I won't reveal my parochial interest by continuing to question you. It'll probably bore everybody else. Have you got anything, comments on that, Ian?
The only piece I'd add to it is, I agree with everything there. I mean, we're working with about 1.2 million micro businesses at the moment, so it's a fair old chunk of micro biz. But I go meet people, that's my, so it isn't very scientific, but I'm come from a sales background. I tell stories. And I pick up stories about other people, so I don't say no to anything. I'll do anything for a bit of free dinner. So I'll turn up at small business gatherings, anything. I did the town awards in Knutsford on Tuesday night, with business. So I'll get out there and just talk to people, and it usually gives me a fairly good steer about the way, and you can do it by sector. You find out what they're doing, they'll talk to you in that, what sort of business they got. So I'd say, agree with everything there. I think the other thing is, if you're really getting that close to it, get out there and don't just be London-centric. I know that's a kind of old one, but there is that, get out into some of these other areas, attend some of these other events. We've managed to encourage HMRC to go out to things in South Shields and stuff like that. And they've said, wow, blown away. It's a bit like, anybody watch that... what's the kind of the hidden boss or whatever it is they have in America, where they get they get the undercover boss and they dress him up in a moustache and a funny hat and put him in his own business. And I've never seen one of those where the business owner hasn't come back and gone, my God, I found out so many things about the business. So without waffling on too long, I think getting out there and talking to people as well is a big part of gathering information, what's going on.
Comments, James? You're on the spot now.
A few things. First of all, and maybe I should say this to the end, but wanted to say thank you to you, Tony, because I think it's been a great day, and the thing I've liked about it the most is we've brought together lots of quite different perspectives which wouldn't always normally meet on a really important topic, and I've learnt a lot from it. So thank you. On some of the issues that you raised, the website sympathises enormously with users of our website. There's a lot on there, and it's hard to find, and often it is easiest to find things by Googling it, which is not a great place to be. We are redoing it this year. That's the plan. and that should make it easier to access. And versions of the new website have already been tested with some users. I think that will be step one, because the way people access information is basically changing, and those that have them, we do have one, although it's only partially developed, are basically finding that people are interacting with statistics much more through APIs, programmatically, rather than through websites. And there's a big area in national statistics to try and basically make sure that the statistics we put out there are referenced by Google Gemini, Anthropic Claude, Microsoft Copilot. So when you ask what's UK GDP, you get UK GDP rather than a made up number, and that's something we need to work out how to play into that ecosystem. So just to pick up the point on the website. But yeah, I mean, on businesses, it's interesting. So I think we've got like a massive opportunity right now. As you said, we've got a register that's going from a little over 3 million firms on it to 5.5. That's a massive change. And it will give us the capability to survey micro businesses in a way that we could never have done before. That can go two ways. We could be intensely annoying to lots of micro businesses, or we could unlock a lot of value for the economy as a whole, and for the micro businesses. And so, obviously, we need to make sure we're on the second path. Would really like to work with these two gentlemen on that, and make sure that we partner in our approach with the relevant business organisations. Do think that's the right way to think about it, ease and value. So what mode of collection is the most easiest to kind of interact with? Mobile phone probably is probably a good place to shoot for there, and it's something we have been developing technology for on our household surveys, and maybe that's one way to think about it when you're targeting a very small business. Yeah, there's definitely the question of how can we tap into existing information and use permissions to do that, rather than ask people to submit something they might have already submitted somewhere else. And so I'm sure we can look at that. Perhaps also working with you on information that you may have, but we'll have some from the register. I love your idea on playing it back, and we've got to think through how we do it. And we're an organisation of 5,000 playing a population of millions, so we can't do something that's kind of bespoke and needs lots of human intervention. We need to build something that's kind of more algorithmic and useful, but I'm sure we can think of what we can do there. And also I think there's something in terms of the value, in terms of people understanding the contribution they're making. So there's that playback to the business, but there's representation basically, and seeing how the data is used. So there's lots to think about there, and we've got some time, because as I talked through, as Phil talked through, it'll be a while before we get this business register up and running. But we really need to think through deliberately, I think, first with the likes of yourselves, and then maybe with a more formal consultation. How do we do this so it's easy and people get the most value from it?
Yes, questions, yes.
So I don't mean to be disrespectful, and I'll preface that by saying I'm 72, but I don't notice many Generation Y and Generation Z people in this room. In our experience with our experience with students setting them collecting primary data tasks is the younger generation are very nimble and very imaginative in terms of how they approach obtaining data. And I would suggest that many of us are actually quite conservative, quite conventional, and quite rigid in how we approach data gathering. And perhaps we could learn more from the younger generations to open more avenues to more data of more different kinds that are more useful to the users.
So I'm sure that's a very valid observation, but I'm even older than 72, so I'm failing to understand. When you say more different kinds, can I Could you give me an example?
I'm thinking more different approaches, using social media approaches. You know, they're very, very in tune with social media. Different kinds. We very much emphasize qualitative data. I mean, I can't see how this system is set up to absorb and use and feedback from qualitative data. But if we want to get closer to the real world, we need to incorporate qualitative data in our gathering as well.
So I've got 3 people now. Should we ask 1, 2, 3? Could you go first? And then, yes, Liz.
Yes, a couple of points. People don't trust what they don't know. And you need trust in order to get people to deliver their information to you. And I think one of the biggest problems is because if we look at the DBT's business growth support service, about 16% of small and micro businesses in particular will ever use it because it's got a government stamp on it. And there is a feeling and perception that isn't necessarily right, of course, that if I give you my information, it's going to go to HMRC. And the only way to earn trust is to earn it. And actually, you've got to go where people are and not expect them to come to you. They don't, and they won't. So the question is more about how do you work with the right partners who've already got that trust, who can say, we're a trusted intermediary, and we can help you to get that information. Now, Ian's point about giving something back and some feedback back is great, but I don't want all of the feedback. So it has to be targeted to a certain extent to things that are really useful to me. And the point that's just been made about the channels that younger people are using, etc., may be those channels where if you go out and find people on those channels, you're more likely to get a response. Language is really, really important. If we're communicating, there's no point in communicating in ONS language, or HMRC language. You have to communicate in people's language, because otherwise I don't want to have to spend 3 seconds interpreting what you mean by a particular word. I've lost it, you've lost me, I've gone. So we really need to think very carefully about how we put the communications together, the channels that we use, how we get out there and engage with people as opposed to expecting them to come to us, I would say.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, please.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that, and I agree with what's just been said. But I mean, there are your organisations to collect data, but there's also someone from Dent, if I may say, from the British Chambers of Commerce at the back. The British Chambers has about 80,000 members, quite a lot of them small, and they do surveys, as I'm sure you know, which also look at micro businesses, and the London Chamber of Commerce itself produces something which is now very statistically solid, because it's been going on for about 10 years, using a sample and making sure that by Savannah, who do that for us. And that, I think, has already been inputted, I think, by Tony. We had very meetings where we did explain all this. So I think there is interest in becoming engaged as well. But also I think the thing that interests the business a lot is what they get back, not just, it's the information of what everyone, is thinking. And there is a clear divide between how those micro and smaller businesses feel, for example, in London, as against the bigger ones. The fact that there is increasing concentration going on leaves smaller firms a lot less optimistic about the future, even though there may be some really exciting new tech ones being developed. But of course, what happens with the chambers is that they provide the actual support tailored to the individual firms to help them with exports or training or whatever it is that they need. So somehow or other, it needs to be a sort of holistic thing as well, that those things are inputted into yourselves and you just add to the information that we all need. So I think that's basically the point of that.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, coming again from the micro businesses, you have talked about how you are expanding your survey base very dramatically from 3.5 to 5.5 million or something like that. It's very big. That is a survey of the businesses, core businesses. It's picking up more micro businesses. If you're doing national accounts, you're thinking of outputs, expenditures, but you also think about incomes, because those are the three things you're trying to actually match up ultimately. At present, you do have a labour force survey which collects data on self-employed people. It also collects data supposedly on their income. So here we've kind of got an income component of national accounts that is coming in. Has there been any attempt to use the income side of information from something like the labour force survey as an input into what is going on in micro businesses, or has that been an entirely separate activity?
So we do look at the three measures, and then we do try and balance and integrate them.
Yeah, but that's at the aggregate level. I'm talking about very specifically about small micro businesses which are picked up, because I am recorded there as, between inverted commas, a self-employed person, possibly with no employees. And I am nevertheless asked to deliver not just things about my demographics or what branch I'm in, but I'm also asked to deliver something about my income.
So let me try and answer the question. So with the fullness of time, we do the integration, and the tax data too will also give us more information. Initially, we're all on the output side, because that's what's leading the data for the first 6 months or so. So we are dependent on that data then. I don't know whether we've gone through and tried to do some inferences from that balances process, and what that tells you about the missing small business population. But I can check that. But we can only do that with the fullness of time at the moment, and what the ability to survey that population, be it directly or indirectly through the various business groups, would be able to would allow us to do more in real time.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't want any more questions, but is there one? Fine. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yes.
There's always a struggle to find users or communicate with users, and I don't think the ONS is exceptional by not really having much of a clue as to who uses its data. So why not simply put a comment box on the bottom of every press release and every data release, a bit like an Amazon review type box? That would allow you to see who, or give you a flavour of who's using the data. And that's the time when I think, I just wish this table had this, or why isn't there that breakdown? I think it'd be quite an easy thing to do. And if it's going to be problematic, you can always ignore the responses.
Yeah, you can.
Grant Fitzner puts a lot of stuff there, and we can all reply or whoever. And
we can look at that with the new website. I mean, the trickiness is sometimes the commentary may not be very polite, which is unfortunate to host on the website. But I'm sure we can find a way to moderate through some of that. But you're right, capturing feedback is something that we need to do more of.
Let me just thank all our speakers today, for their valuable input, and those of you who put forward your comments. I'd just like to point out my two colleagues, Phyllis, Macfarlane and Ian Mackay. It's us three that form Better Statistics, and we're the better for it, I'm sure. We actually also subsidise mainly, so please consider donating something to the cause, because if you've benefited at all from this event, mainly it's us three that have paid for it. Thank you to the National Liberal Club for their small discount, which definitely helped. As I say, I want to thank all our speakers. I think it's been a very interesting day. I'm actually left with the thought of, James earlier said, our national statistics needs you. I'm just very struck by the thought or the idea that somehow our national statistics, AXA, Office of National Statistics, whatever you may call it, needs to get across to the public, not only the business, but public, how important it is that we enter into a partnership for the good of the country, that we help them and that they should help us. I don't know how you achieve that, but that really, I think, is very much the objective. But what we need from you as leadership that points out how important collecting decent information is for the community as a whole, and that we all have a part to play in that. And it's important, and maybe not a civic duty, it's a civic value. I leave you all with that thought, and thank you very much for coming today, and thank you, James, for supporting this in the National Statistics. Thank you very much. Thanks, David.